So I'm going to talk about the Australians' well-being and resilience during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm going to give you a brief context of the project, the aims, and then some findings, some of the key findings. So thinking back, March 11th, 2020, the World Health Organization declared that the coronavirus was a global pandemic. By March 14th, Australia had reached its first 100 cases. By October 2020, Port Victoria had been in lockdown for 112 days, which was the longest continuous lockdown period in the world. And by November 2020, we had had almost 28,000 cases and nearly 1,000 deaths. So looking back, we actually were doing quite well, but at the time it was quite scary. So the aim of this project was to examine how Australians are affected by and respond to the pandemic. So in November 2020, we administered a national online survey to 1,380 Australians aged 16 years and older. We asked about various demographic and background characteristics. We asked about their COVID-19 experiences, perceptions, beliefs, their impacts of COVID. We asked about various individual differences, variables, and mental health, loneliness, and resilience. So I want to highlight three key findings. The first is on the positive and negative correlates. And we found that the most significant positive correlates of well-being and resilience was having high interpersonal trust. So interpersonal trust is a protective factor which has been shown in other research to be positively related to several adaptive outcomes, such as positive coping and higher quality of life. So increasing people's interpersonal trust is critical in promoting well-being and resilience in future crises. This had a moderate association, but the strongest associations were negative, and they were having an external locus of control, so believing that you really don't have any control over what's going to happen to you. That had the strongest correlations with having poor mental health, being more lonely, and being less resilient. We also showed, our findings showed that having high intolerance of uncertainty, so in particular high inhibitory anxiety. So that means where you just become kind of paralyzed by being so anxious. So items on the subscale include the smallest doubt can stop me from acting. So this was the strongest association that we had with poor mental health, being more lonely, and being less resilient. This, however, should be distinguished from, we also looked at prospective anxiety. So prospective anxiety is that if you don't like being taken by surprise, that had a moderate association, but it wasn't as strong as having that inhibitory anxiety. So being kind of paralyzed by that uncertainty, that had strong correlations with having poor mental health, being more lonely, and being less resilient. The next finding I want to highlight were the differential impacts. So we found that the groups most negatively affected by COVID were students, the unemployed, and single people, in particular single people living with their parents and family. So we found that younger people were less resilient than older people. So at the beginning of COVID, we thought the older people were going to do worse, and we were, trying to protect our grandparents. Older people were dying at higher rates, but actually our findings showed that younger people were less resilient than older people. They had poorer mental health, and they were more lonely as compared to older people. And it was basically this precarity that made the big difference. So younger people were more disadvantaged because they were more likely to be student, they were more likely to be unemployed, and they were more likely to be living with their parents and family. So the qualitative responses show that the younger people had shown the most change in their employment, typically for the worse, and so that's why the younger people were more vulnerable. And then the last finding is the role of trust and belief in COVID-19 conspiracy theories and mis- and disinformation. So these were relatively smaller associations, but I think a lot of it, the research is coming out now that confirms this, is that trust in government, so trust in federal government, state government, in our study was associated with actually, so the more you trusted your government, the better your mental health and well-being was. So if you distrusted your government, then you had increased depression, anxiety, stress, increased loneliness, and decreased resilience. We also showed small to moderate associations between belief in COVID-19 conspiracy theories and mis and disinformation being associated with increased depression, anxiety, and stress, increased loneliness, and less resilience. So this misinformation angle we're going to be pursuing more in CRIS 2.0, and that project is going to look kind of at the intersection of online racism and misinformation, how they thrive, how they're interrelated. And then with that, we hope to examine the ingredients for effective, safe, and effective online interventions to combat racism and misinformation. And that's also going to be, that last bit is also going to be part of our ARC discovery, which is leading on from this. Thank you.